There's only this England, which nauseates my soul, nauseates my spirit and my body. I might as well be blown over the cliffs here in the strong wind into the rough white sea as sit at this banquet of vomit. This life, this England. I was born in Eastwood, a mining village of some 3,000 souls, about 8 miles from Nottingham, and 1 mile from the small stream, the Erewash, which divides Nottinghamshire from Derbyshire. It is hilly country, looking northeast towards Mansfield and the Sherwood Forest district. To me, as a child and a young man, it was still the old England of the forest and agricultural past. There were no motor cars. The mines were, in a sense, an accident in the landscape. Robin Hood and his merry men were not very far away. Down the steep street, Scargill Street, the Wesleyan's chapel was put up, and I was born in the little corner shop just above. Along the hilltop ran the Nottingham Road with the scrappy, ugly mid-Victorian shops. The little marketplace, with a superb outlook, ended the village on the Derbyshire side and was just here left bare, with the Sun Inn on one side. In this queer jumble of the old England and the new, I came into consciousness.
I consider that David Herbert Lawrence is one of the 10 or 15 writers of the 20th century who has undoubted world status. But there's a paradox connected sometimes with great art. It seems as though a universality of vision, a universality of appeal, is dependent on a kind of regional narrowness. James Joyce turned Dublin into the Eternal City. Thomas Hardy converted Dorset into the whole howling, hostile universe. What did Lawrence do with Eastwood? I don't think I'd have come here in this centennial year to this small Midland town if I weren't convinced in a sense that Lawrence's great prophetic vision, his great prophetic powers, did spring out of a certain provincial narrowness. In other words, what did Lawrence make of Eastwood? And for that matter, what does Eastwood, 100 years after his birth, make of Lawrence? Let's find out. Apparently not much. The tradition persists that Lawrence let the side down. He probed the dirty alleys of the human psyche. He used the people of Eastwood to illustrate a thesis about the importance of the animal passions. You'll find his name around in a few dutiful but modest inscriptions. But Eastwood has become no Stratford-on-Avon. This isn't Lawrence Town. True, there's a Lawrence Museum. This is looked after by a lady named Enid Goodband, who, against a certain amount of opposition, has devoted a great deal of her life to this museum and to Lawrence himself.
I think it's been born in the third house where he lived. He lived there 6 till he was 18, and my mother lived there 57 years. This awakened my interest. And then when Lady Chatterley was published, I decided to find out the truth. So I spoke to all the people that knew him. And I got to know Lawrence the man.
You got to know Lawrence specifically, the Eastwood man, though, didn't you?
Yes.
Tell me, what do the Eastwood people think about him? Or what did they think about him?
At the beginning, I think mostly hatred.
Why? Why was that?
Because of his novels, mostly Sons and Lovers. He wrote of Eastwood people. He never bothered to change the names. Women in Love, The Rainbow, The Lost Girl, again about Eastwood people. Even Lady Chatterley, that was based on, he got the name from an Eastwood family. They didn't understand him. This lonely, odd figure. As a child, of course, he was called Mardy because he didn't play with the boys, a very slim child.
What did he think about his father?
Well, I think underlying in Sons and Lovers, he did secretly admire him. And he said later on, of course, if I could write this book again, I would write quite differently about my father. But there was so much bitterness, so much hatred, so many rows. I don't think it was right. She should have turned the children against the father.
Against the father, yeah. But I've heard that even now in some of the pubs they talk about what a good man the father was and what a bad lad Bert Lawrence was. Is that true?
Oh, definitely. A few years ago, if you went into the local pub, the Three Tons, which was the Moon and Stars, they'd say, well, the father were worth 10 of the son.
Detested by some, still detested, Lawrence did his own share of detestation, but he was a great lover as well. This town, Eastwood, was a place to get out of with all its smugness, its hypocrisy, its brutality, its sanctimoniousness, but it was also a way into a bigger world. If you like, it was a dirty little port from which Lawrence could sail into nature. Nature got into his novels from the very beginning. Nature as the cyclical process of life, nature harnessed to farming. Nature got into his books out of Eastwood.
The Brangwens had lived for generations on the marsh farm in the meadows where the Erewash twisted sluggishly through the alder trees, separating Derbyshire from Nottinghamshire. Living on rich land, on their own land, near to a growing town, they'd forgotten what it was to be in straitened circumstances. Heaven and earth was teeming around them, and how should this cease? They knew the intercourse between heaven and earth, sunshine drawn into the breast and bowels, feeling the pulse and the body of the soil that opened to the furrow for the grain and became smooth and supple after their ploughing. The young corn waved and was silken, and the lustre slid along the limbs of the men who saw it. They took the udder of the cows yielded milk, and the pulse against the hands of the men, the pulse of the blood of the teats of the cows beat into the pulse of the hands of the men. It was enough for them that the earth heaved and opened its furrow to them, that the wind blew to dry the wet wheat and set the young ears of corn wheeling freshly round about. So much warmth and generating and pain and death did they know in their blood, earth and sky and beast and green plants, that they lived full and surcharged, their senses full fed, their faces always turned to the heat of the blood, staring into the sun, dazed with looking towards the source of generation, unable to turn round.
At this point, we literally reach the limits of our investigation. Lawrence wrote a novel during the First World War called Women in Love, and in this novel there's a character named Gerald Critch, wealthy, mixed-up mine owner, and he is based on a member of the family that owned this land in Lawrence's day and still owns it. The family resented this portraiture in Lawrence's novel, and they still resent it. The hatred, the disgust go on. We cannot get onto this land. This isn't Mrs. Lawrence's piano, but it might well have been. It stands, in a sense, for her middle-class ambitions. The lace curtains in the front room, the rosewood cottage piano, gentility. She was a cut above her husband. She spoke posh. She read books, for God's sake. Lawrence, in many ways, took after her. He, too, read books. He loved, as she did, flowers, music, the softer things of life. But there was one aspect of her that he couldn't accept. That was her cult, her philosophy of getting on. You had to get on in life. You had to have some money in the bank. You had to have nice clothes to wear at church on Sunday. You had to speak posh. In later life, Lawrence had no nostalgia for his mother's world, but surprisingly enough, he had a certain nostalgia for his father's. His father may have been brutal and Philistine, but the world he lived in had a certain tough honesty in its rough male companionship, and honesty was the watchword of Lawrence's entire career.
The miners worked underground as a sort of intimate community. They knew each other practically naked, and with a curious close intimacy, and the darkness and the underground remoteness of the pit stall and the continual presence of danger made the physical, instinctive, and intuitional contact between men very highly developed. A contact almost as close as touch, very real and very powerful. That physical awareness and intimate togetherness was at its strongest down pit. When the men came up into the light, they blinked. They had, in a measure, to change their flow. Nevertheless, they brought with them above ground the curious, dark intimacy of the mine, the naked sort of contact. And if I think of my childhood, it is always as if there was a lustrous sort of inner darkness like the gloss of coal in which we moved and had our real being.
Those pits have no real being now. They've been reduced to chunks of industrial archaeology. But it's useful to look at this remnant of the tandem headgear today, because the rectangular regularity of it, the rational, logical shape of it is totally un-Lawrentian. It's the kind of thing that Lawrence revolted against. What he wanted was the irregularity of natural life, the shape of snakes, of trees, plants, landscapes. But there's a kind of irony in the fact that there's a plaque attached to this structure which commemorates not the man who worked here so much as his son. This is a paradox in the sense that when Lawrence's father was working here, he was engaged in the reality of life, while Lawrence the son was preparing poetic fripperies which were of no value at all in the great march forward of industrial civilization. But when we talk about these two elements in Lawrence's life, the father and the mother, we'd better get this right. We like to think that Lawrence's propensity for art, beauty, came from the mother, and there was only a kind of rough, masculine brutality derived from the father. It wasn't as easy as that. The miners themselves reacted against this rectangular rationalism in the direction of a desire for beauty. The wives just stood behind their white lace curtains and looked out on nothing.
Now, the colliers had also an instinct of beauty. The colliers' wives had not. The collier fled out of the house as soon as he could, away from the nagging materialism of the woman. With the women, it was always, this is broken. Now you've got to mend it, or else we want this, that, and the other. And where is the money coming from? The collier didn't know and didn't care very deeply. His life was otherwise. He loved the countryside, just the indiscriminating feel of it. Very often he loved his garden, and very often he had a genuine love of the beauty of flowers. I have known it often and often in colliers. Life for him did not consist in facts, but in a flow. The women almost invariably nagged about material things. She was taught to do it. She was encouraged to do it. It was a mother's business to see that her sons got on, and it was the man's business to provide the money.
Lawrence got on, but not in any sense that his mother would have approved of. True, he made the big leap into the great city of Nottingham, the first eastward boy to get a higher education there. But in Nottingham, something terrible happened. He irregularly allied himself to the aristocracy, but not the British aristocracy that ruled the coal mines. At the house of his languages professor at Nottingham University College, he fell in love with the professor's wife. The professor was H.C. Weekly, best known as a philologist, the author of Adjectives and Other Words. He was a good man, a warm man, but not a fiery one. His wife, Frida, responded at once to the genuine fire of the young man from Eastwood. She was fiery enough herself, a handsome woman from a noble German family. Her maiden name was von Richthofen, and her cousin was soon to be known as the Red Baron. She ran away with Lawrence with hardly a second thought, leaving not only her husband, but her 3 children. In a sense, she was running home, back to Europe, out of exile. Lawrence entered exile and lived and died in it. Lawrence was a provincial man, a man of the working classes. In a sense, is the patron saint of all writers who never had an Oxford or Cambridge education, who are somewhat despised by those who have. When he published his first books, the Bloomsbury intellectuals like E.M. Forster, Bertrand Russell, and Lady Ottoline Morell patronized him, and he responded by satirizing them in his books. Lady Ottoline Morell especially, an aristocratic lady, passionate, possessive, with no talent at all except for self-exhibition. With the coming of the First World War, England turned itself into a prison, and Lawrence felt himself to be securely locked into it. All he could do was to shake the bars and rage in impotent fury. But some instinct drove him to this extremity of the country, very close to Land's End, from which he could look out from his bars at the Atlantic, which symbolized freedom. And so he rented this cottage here in the hamlet of Zenor, midway between Penzance and St. Ives, and tried to import a kind of freedom into a country which seemed to have lost it. For the most part, Lawrence and Frida were alone, although they weren't left alone. The state interfered. The military authorities insisted on calling up Lawrence to see whether his body was fit to be turned into cannon fodder. Medical officers probed it, derided it, impaired Lawrence's dignity, but Lawrence's tuberculosis gave them their answer. Lawrence, with this thin, sick, white body, was not a dying man. He was a man raging with life. The face was the face of a major prophet, the bristling red beard and the fierce eyes. But he was obviously a dangerous man, a dissident, an outsider. The hypocrisy of a country that was waging war against his wife's own nation did impair Lawrence's patriotism very severely. It didn't make him pro-German, but he became anti-British in a very idiosyncratic way. Nobody loved England more than Lawrence did, but he felt England had betrayed herself. She turned herself into a puling, dribbling monster of sanctimonious commercialism. England had been a lion among nations, a roaring beast, the England of Chaucer and Shakespeare and Fielding and William Blake. But now she'd become so much dead mutton.
was in 1915 the old world ended. In the winter of 1915-1916, the spirit of the old London collapsed. Genuine debasement began, the unspeakable baseness of the press and the public voice, the reign of that bloated ignominy, John Bull. We hear so much of the bravery and horrors at the front, but we hear too little of the collapse of the proud human spirit at home, the triumph of sordid, rampant, raging meanness. At home stayed all the jackalls, middle-aged male and female jackalls, and they bit us all. Away in the west, they lived alone in their cottage by the savage Atlantic. He hated the war and said so to the few Cornish people around. And because of his isolation and his absolute separateness, he was marked out as a spy.
Trapped in wartime Cornwall, the only solace Lawrence could find in a militarized England full of jackals and hyenas was in a vision of the ancient Celtic past, in which, as he might have put it, altars were raised, not in the desiccated brain, but in the living loins.
Cornwall is a country that makes a man psychic. The longer he stayed, the more intensely it had that effect on him. It was as if he were developing second sight and second hearing. He would go out and call softly for the spirits, the presences he felt coming down from the moors in the night. To Arthur de Danann, he would call softly. To Arthur de Danann, be with me. And it was as if he felt them come. The days grew shorter before the corn was all down from the moors, and then the Cornish night would gradually come down upon the dark, shaggy moors that were like the fur of some beast, and upon the pale grey granite masses, so ancient and druidical, suggesting blood sacrifice. He felt he was over the border in another world, over the border in that twilight, awesome world of the previous Celts, and at the same time to understand most sensitively the dark flicker of animal life about him. Rise, then, life, he seemed to say to the things. And he no longer saw its sickeningness.
The war was over, but the jackals were still there. Lawrence requested permission to leave the country, his right as a free man, but the bureaucratic jackals were very slow in granting him a passport. England didn't want him, but England seemed very reluctant to let him go. As for Lawrence, he'd made up his mind to leave England for good and start what he called his savage pilgrimage. He was looking for a country dimly prefigured in the woods and fields of the Nottinghamshire of his boyhood and described in the somewhat brutal but honest male life of the miners. He was looking for a country whose nature he only imperfectly saw himself, in which magic ruled rather than reason, in which there was sexual harmony and total free play for the instincts. A country in which was practiced what Lawrence called a kind of phallic worship. No such country has ever really existed except in Lawrence's imagination. Nevertheless, he was determined to find it, and so he set off. England was finished, and he was finished with England.
He knew he was being watched all the time. Strange men questioning the cottage woman next door as to all his doings. He began to feel a criminal. A sense of guilt, of self-horror began to grow up in him. He saw himself set apart from mankind, a Cain, or worse. So he discovered the great secret, to stand alone as his own judge of himself, absolutely. Then the mongrel-mouthed world would say and do what it liked. He felt broken off from his fellow men. He felt broken off from the England he had belonged to. The ties were gone. He was loose like a single timber of some wrecked ship drifting over the face of the earth, without a people, without a land. So be it. He was broken apart. Apart he would remain. A lizard ran out on a rock and looked up, listening, no doubt, to the sounding of the spheres. And what a dandy fellow, the right toss of the chin for you and swirl of a tail. If men were as much men as lizards are lizards, they'd be worth looking at.
A lizard was a lizard, but men had ceased to be men, except perhaps in the countries which Lawrence was yet to discover. On his voyage of discovery, he visited many countries, and to all of them he brought the gifts that had been nurtured when he was a boy and a young man in Nottinghamshire: searching spirit, capacity for empathy, for entering into the life of people, places, and things, a miraculous eye for notating the surface of nature. His feeling, his reverence for beasts and birds and fish and even plants is unmatched in the whole of English literature, unmatched even by Blake or by Wordsworth. This feeling for things is something that makes Lawrence quite exceptional. Even in his domestic life, while Frida Lawrence lay in bed, lazily smoking cigarettes, Lawrence scrubbed floors, got water from the well, chopped wood, prepared the meals, washed her underwear, picked figs. When he made a fire, the fire would always go. He never rose above this respect for the simple skills of the peasant and the artisan. Lawrence, the homegrown writer, became Lawrence, the exotic writer. He left the land of chill winds, boiled puddings, and coal mines for countries where lizards busked in the sun and where, he hoped, natural man, naked, uninhibited, prevailed. He traveled with a restlessness that ought to have killed him, and eventually did. A restlessness that expressed itself in poems, essays, and novels that poured out of him in a kind of white heat. One of the countries that Lawrence and Frida visited was Australia. As we might expect, he responded not with beery good fellowship, matiness, good on you Philistinism, but with a reverence for the strange new life. The birds and the beasts, the inversion of the stars in the heavens, the eerie light, the whole emptiness of the land. Here is Lawrence with a kangaroo.
In the northern hemisphere, life seems to leap at the air or skim under the wind, like stags on rocky ground, or pawing horses, or springy scut-tailed rabbits. But the yellow antipodal kangaroo, when she sits up, who can unseat her, like a liquid drop that is heavy and just touches the earth? The downward drip, the down urge, so much denser than cold-blooded frogs. Her sensitive, long, purebred face, her full antipodal eyes, so dark, so big and quiet and remote, having watched so many empty dawns in silent Australia.
Lawrence is unique in the sense that he's the only writer we have anywhere that lets us into the workshop, lets us see the poem or the essay or the novel actually being made. Thus we're admitted to a kind of improvisation rather than a finished, polished work. It was in Mexico that Lawrence made the final formulation of the new religion that he thought might save mankind. Of course, it wasn't a new religion at all, it was very ancient. He found it among the Aztec Indians, or the relics of their civilization. They'd worshipped a god called Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, which gave a title to this almost final novel of Lawrence's. Who was the plumed serpent? What was he? He was a symbol of fire. He was a sun spirit. He was a symbol of the fire in the loins, above all. And the religion that circled around him was a phallic religion. In a way, Lawrence was doing nothing more than give new words, new expression to his earlier beliefs, his ancient beliefs about the vitality, the importance of the senses and the instincts, and the danger of reason. What Lawrence found in old Mexico was, in a sense, confirmed in New Mexico. Here in New Mexico, really for the first time, he made a home. He even built a house. He contemplated the forming of a new tribe around himself.
I think New Mexico was the greatest experience from the outside world that I've ever had. It certainly changed me forever. Curious as it may sound, it was New Mexico that liberated me from the present era of civilization, the great era of material and mechanical development. The moment I saw the brilliant, proud morning shining high up over the deserts of Santa Fe, something stood still in my soul, and I started to attend. I'll never forget watching the dancers file out at San Geronimo, the long, streaming, glistening black hair of the men. Never shall I forget the utter absorption of the dance, so quiet, so steadily, timelessly rhythmic and silent, with a ceaseless downtread always to the earth's center, the very reverse of the upflow of Dionysiac or Christian ecstasy. Never shall I forget the deep singing of the men at the drum, swelling and sinking, the deepest sound I've heard in all my life. The wonderful, deep sound of men calling to the unspeakable depths.
Lawrence was never a political man, but he did espouse a kind of doctrine of blood and soil, which is always dangerous. He died 3 years before Hitler came to power, and I don't think he would have supported National Socialism, but there was always something a little too sympathetic to him in these brainless political doctrines. Dangerous also this rejection of the institutionalized of science, education, technology, politics, and something a little absurd occasionally too. He knew that the Earth went round the sun, or at least he'd been told that, but when it was repeated to him, he would always tap his solar plexus and say, "I don't feel it here." We have to remember that Lawrence came at a time which was favorable to this new doctrine, which we can call the Doctrine of Natural Man. Throughout the 19th century, Europe had followed a belief in liberal man. Man could improve himself, could create an earthly paradise through education, through science, technology, through better social organization. And writers like H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw were highly optimistic in their belief that man could create a better future. But man's capacity for this creation produced a great world war. Technology, science meant destruction. And so it was inevitable that this reaction against the doctrine came about in writers like Lawrence. Ernest Hemingway, who was his contemporary, believed that man was a hunter, man was a creature of nature, a kind of animal who didn't have to think much but just followed his instincts, followed his trigger finger. Lawrence didn't believe in man the hunter, but he believed in man the sexual creature, the instinctual creature. We, a little wiser perhaps, we've had another war, and now we're mostly inclined to accept the doctrine of imperfect man. We do our best. We try to create better societies, but we don't expect too much. Lawrence did expect too much of his fellow men. He expected them to want to live, and there's nothing harder than to want to live. Hamlet, he said, put forward the alternatives to be or not to be. Lawrence believed that post-war England had decided not to be. He went back to England shortly before his death. He wasn't impressed by what he saw.
It always depresses me to come to my native district. Now I'm turned 40 and have been more or less a wanderer for nearly 20 years. I feel more alien, perhaps, in my home place than anywhere else in the world. But the special depression this time is the great coal strike still going on. In house after house, the families are now living on bread and margarine and potatoes. And the pickets, with bleached faces, squat and lean, stand in silent groups with a certain fatality like hell upon them. And I, who remember the homeward trooping of the colliers when I was a boy, the strange voices of men from the underworld, calling back and forth, strong, and it seemed to me gay with the queer, absorbed gaiety of miners. I shiver and I feel I turn into a ghost myself. And after all, it's not so long ago. I'm only 41. But after the war, the colliers went silent. I know we're on the brink of a class war. I know our vision of life is all wrong. I know that man cannot live by his own will alone. With his soul, he must search for the sources of the power of life, for it is life we want.
What did Lawrence mean by life? It's all too easy to give the wrong answer. If I say that he believed in closer contact between people, it sounds like some vague brotherhood of man slogan. He meant that people should be in contact with each other in a closer personal life. There should be a greater tenderness. And this shouldn't be just a matter of the emotions. It should be also a matter of the intuitions, of the deeper feelings, of the ancient feelings which Lawrence believed the modern man had lost. There should be physical contact, even between man and man. And when Lawrence looked at some of the older civilizations, like that of the Etruscans, he saw what he was looking for, a complete, unashamed enjoyment of bodily functions, of bodily contacts, not necessarily with sexuality in it, but just a sheer enjoyment of physical tenderness. While his wife Frida conducted her little affairs, Lawrence was fiercely chaste. There was still something of the Puritan in him. Sex was too sacred to play around with. Sex meant fidelity. Sex meant tenderness. Lady Chatterley's Lover was Lawrence's last novel, and in it he waged his final battle against the forces of British hypocrisy. Of course, he lost the battle, and the battle was never really won until as recently as 1960, when Lady Chatterley's Lover was no longer regarded as a piece of pornography. Pornography, indeed. Lawrence loathed pornography, and this confusion of a great, tender, candid work with a piece of dirt is a fair example of the lack of subtlety and indeed the lack of candor on the part of those people who control our destinies. When Lawrence's pictures were exhibited at the same time in London, the Home Secretary ordered them to be confiscated. Anything Lawrence did was automatically dirty. With this last book, too, he came back to the place where he'd started. He came back to the Midlands, and he imposed on a Midlands scene a philosophy probably that area was least disposed to accept.
There's a bad time coming, boys. There's a bad time coming. If things go on as they are, there's nothing lies in the future but death and destruction for these industrial masses. You can't insure against the future, except by really believing in the best bit of you and in the power beyond it. So I believe in the little flame between us. It's my Pentecost, the forked flame between me and you. That's what I abide by, and you will abide by. Colliery companies and governments and the money mat of all people notwithstanding. This is my 40th winter, and I can't help all the winters that have been, but this winter I'll stick to my little Pentecost flame and have some peace.
The flame burned high and hot in Lawrence, but it was quenched when he was only 44. William Blake had said, all that lives is holy, and Lawrence believed that too. You even had to accord a kind of sanctity to the life of the tubercles which devoured his lungs. As for death, he never really accepted it. He'd outgrown the Christianity of the Congregationalist chapel of his youth, the resurrection of the life. But he believed in a different kind of immortality. The cycle went on. Nothing was really lost. Nothing was obliterated. Lawrence is dead, but he's still more alive now, perhaps, than ever he was. He still teaches hope. What kind of hope? Well, perhaps hope that man won't destroy himself through his own cleverness, that he'll realize that reality doesn't reside in the great institutionalized philosophies and faiths, politics, religion, technology, that we rely finally on the mystery inside us, which is located in the loins, in the nerves, in the instincts, in the great uncharted forests of the unconscious. Mystery that links us, if you like, to the amoeba and to the solar system. This mystery is with us still, and Lawrence was the great custodian of that mystery.
And it was a long time before I was able to say to myself, I'm not going to be ashamed of my sexual thoughts and desires. They are me, myself. They're part of my life, and nobody will make me feel ashamed about them. It is long since I came to that decision, but I remember how much freer I felt. I've no longer anything to be in a funk about lest they should find it out. Accept the sexual, physical being of yourself and of every other creature. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of the physical functions. Don't be afraid of the so-called obscene words. If you don't put back a bit of the old warmth into life, there is savage disaster ahead.